So Timor-Leste gets around 25,000 tourists a year. In comparison, Bali, which is an hour and a half flight away, last year Bali Airport had 23 million tourists go through it. 25,000, 23 million.
That is today's guest, Jonty Crane, a New Zealand-based traveler who's currently volunteering in one of the world's least visited countries, which we're going to talk about today, Timor-Leste. In this episode, you'll discover why this small island nation, which gets only 25,000 tourists per year, by the way, compared to nearby Bali, which is getting millions, why that might make traveling here extra special. You also get the lowdown on the best things to see and do in Timor-Leste. We're going to dive into the concept of slow travel versus traditional tourism, explore the idea that maybe some of the most rewarding destinations might be those that come with the least amount of infrastructure. That's, of course, entirely dependent on your perspective, but definitely some food for thought on this topic. Plus, Jonty shares his curated list of 3 other incredible lesser visited destinations worth traveling to, and loads more. It's all happening right now in this show. So buckle up, strap in. Thanks for being here, and welcome to the Zero to Travel podcast, my friend.
You're listening to the Zero to Travel podcast, where we explore exciting travel-based work, lifestyle, and business opportunities, helping you to achieve your wildest travel dreams. And now your host, world wanderer and travel junkie, Jason Moore.
Hey, it's Jason here with ZeroToTravel.com. Welcome to the show. Thank you for hanging out, letting me bring a little travel into your ears today. This is the show to help you travel the world on your terms, to fill your life with as much travel as you desire, no matter what your situation or experience. You might know, or you might notice, if you're new, that when it comes to destinations here on this show, I love to cover those lesser known places, the hidden gems in established places, alternative destinations, kind of like the, if you want this kind of thing, go here instead of there to avoid the crowds, the off the beaten track spots, all that type of stuff. This is the podcast for that. So if you dig, be sure to follow the pod. And if you know someone who is an expert on a lesser visited destination, or you know of an area of the world that more people should see, and you are a bit of an expert on that, perhaps you could drop me a line. Jason at ZeroToTravel.com is my email. My goal with these destination episodes is to get your wanderlust flowing and give you some bookmarkable, let's call them, ideas, resources, and so on for future trips. I hope this one delivers the goods. I think it does. By the way, you can check out Jonty's website if you want more information on exploring Timor-Leste over at exploringtimor.com. We'll link up to that. He's got some books that we'll link up to, and they have a podcast now as well, Exploring Timor-Leste, the podcast, which you can find on the website, and we'll link up to that. So without further ado, let's dive into this episode. Stick around on the back end, by the way. I've got a fun fact related to this interview. It's a whale of a good one. There's a little hint there. And lastly, don't forget ZeroToTravel.com/newsletter for a free newsletter. Goes out once a week. Feel free to stay in touch over there. Would love to welcome you to the community over there. Thank you for listening. Now, please enjoy my conversation with Jonty. Jonty Crane, welcome to the Zero to Travel podcast, my friend. How you doing?
Thank you. Very good. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hanging out in one of the least visited countries in the world. You are, right? The small Southeast Asian island of Timor-Leste. That's where you're at this morning, right? Or this afternoon. I don't even know what time it is there.
It's the evening, yeah. So Timor-Leste is plus 9 hours. It's the same as Korea.
I checked out your LinkedIn profile, and according to my count, you had like 23 different work experiences. It shows you like the beginning, and then it says, see 18 more. And I was like, 18 more? This guy's had more jobs than me. I didn't know there was Obviously, you can talk about what directly led you to take on this volunteering gig, which we're going to talk about, which is really cool, by the way. It seems like your role is to just promote Timor-Leste as a destination. Is that correct?
A part of what I'm doing here. Yeah, so it's a bit of a mix between it's part of my job, but it's also kind of my hobby, so it gets a bit blurred. But it's a good thing to do.
You've also traveled to 75 countries, so you've done a lot of traveling. what has the travel lifestyle been like for you? Has it been like work, travel, save up travel, or has it been like worked in a corporate job for a long time, quit to travel? Like, how did you do all this traveling, and how did that mesh with your career and the rest of your life?
That's a great opening question. Thank you, Jason. So I was a bit of a late starter to travel. So I didn't really start traveling until probably my mid-20s when I kind of started my career. So I was as you said, I need to look at my LinkedIn profile again now, but a lot of them are like program management jobs, and projects, they last for a finite period of time and then you move on to the next project. So that's been kind of my lifestyle. So I've had kind of like a professional career, I guess, for kind of 15 or 20 years. And I started off with a typical kind of, you get 4 or 5 weeks leave and I might go and do some trips. And I mean, I did get a bit more exotic. You do this sort of, went to Istanbul was like the first place I ever went by myself. And that was kind of a really cool experience. And then I got up to, I think 2011, I went to Syria for a couple of weeks by myself, which was it was the right time to go to Syria. There's like this kind of window of opportunity. And then I moved to New Zealand. Well, actually, it must have been before then because I moved to New Zealand in 2010. So I have a British accent, but I moved to New Zealand in my late 20s. And then that is my home now, basically. I've been there kind of 14 years. I'm a citizen. So, and then working in New Zealand, which I kind of thought, I'll open up the other side of the world because living in the UK, you think, okay, where's the other side? What I hadn't really appreciated is New Zealand's like a long way from anywhere. Basically, you sort of think Asia. Well, actually, Asia's like halfway between kind of Europe and New Zealand. So it wasn't necessarily the best move from a travel perspective in terms of accessibility. And then I started discovering this amazing thing at work called unpaid leave. And I was like, so I could just like I use up my 4 or 5 weeks, and then I might use up another couple of weeks, and then you get into like 7 or 8 weeks in a year, and that's pretty good. And I had a very understanding boss, and I must have been quite persuasive, and I'd always have a good rationale. I'd plan it around a long weekend, so I'm only taking like 4 days leave, but then you can get like a 9-day trip, and you can go and go to Papua New Guinea or go to some interesting places. Went to Iran for a couple of weeks. So that kind of spiraled. And then I guess in 2018, I said to my boss about could I do like a sabbatical, secondment sabbatical. That's it. So could I take 4 or 5 months out and still have my job at the end of it? And they were like, yeah, we can do that, because I'd been there for a while. That's one of the jobs I had. I've been there 5 years at that place. So that was kind of one of the longer jobs. And so I went a big trip and it was amazing. And I came back, and then about 6 months later, I said, so can I do another sabbatical? And she was like, well, that's kind of like, you've pushed the limit there a bit. Like you can't just disappear.
That was
again.
Gutsy of you, Jonty. I mean,
well, what I did is I said,
they're like, come on, man. They sounded more polite than I would have been. I'd be like, dude, you just got back.
Basically. And so then I was like, well, actually, I'll just back myself and I'll kind of quit and I'll go traveling for 5 months and then I'll come back and then I'll get a job. And that was the kind of plan. Now, it was good. I did do that because that was 2019. And actually, I did that big trip 4 or 5 months, and it was there was some big hiking in the Himalaya, and there's some stuff in Europe, and there was some various bits of travel. And then that Christmas 2019, kind of beginning 2020, I did a month trip to Africa. Went a couple of weeks in Ethiopia, which is an amazing country to visit, and then spent a couple of weeks hiking in Uganda up the third highest mountain, which was amazing. But I have to say, getting back from the kind of mountain in Uganda back to New Zealand, I think took like 47 hours. And it was just the longest trip ever. And I got home and I was like, that's it. I'm over travel. I have traveled out. I'm good. I'm done. And then like 2 months later, COVID-19 happened. So it was kind of like perfect timing, because I feel a lot for a lot of people who are, they had lots of exciting travel plans. And normally I'd book everything like a year in advance and everything would have been sorted. And then COVID happened, and I was, for the first time in like 10 years, I didn't have like the next 12 months worth of travel organized. So it was, it was interesting time around the world, but actually the timing worked quite well for me. And then after, COVID lockdown, particularly in New Zealand, where the country really was kind of closed for the best, 2.5 years, you just couldn't leave. That was kind of useful because I kind of rebuilt up my kind of enthusiasm for doing some travel. And then I went and did a big hike in the Himalaya. And then 2023, I went and did another kind of 4 month trip. I kind of feel that 2 weeks isn't enough. quitting your job and going traveling. I was reading a blog today of this Swiss couple who've been driving around the world for the last 38 years. That's kind of the extremes of that. And I'm not really, the thought of traveling nonstop for anything more than 4 or 5 months, it's just a bit exhausting. But it's quite hard to have a career with 4 or 5 month kind of gaps in it. That's what I'm kind of finding. So anyway, I did a trip, and with my partner, we were thinking, okay, what are we going to do next when we get back? And this idea about volunteering kind of came up. So in New Zealand, there's an NGO, it's called Volunteer Service Abroad. They've been running, I think, for about 60 years. Their first kind of president was Sir Edmund Hillary, who was the first person to climb Everest with Tenzin Norgay. And there's a kind of equivalent, most kind of developed countries will have equivalents. So like in Australia, there's the AVI program. In America, there's the Peace Corps. There's the Koreans have got a system. The Japanese have got a system. So there's actually a lot of developed countries, they'll have funded by, generally government funded. I mean, so the sort of the Foreign Office or like the State Department is kind of seen as a bit of a soft power kind of thing. And so they will fund people to go and work basically and support kind of developing countries. And so I guess you come at it and a lot of the advertising is all very kind of altruistic, and it is, you're giving back and you're sharing your experience and you're really helping these kind of poor countries with their development, which you are doing, and that's fantastic. But you're also having an amazing adventure. Like you get to basically live in some very interesting countries. And I think Peace Corps is 2 years, VSA is generally kind of a year. And you're volunteering, but they all cover your costs. So our accommodation is covered and we get a bit of an expenses. And so we've lived here for a year, and our house back in New Zealand, we've rented out. And so we're not kind of losing money. We're kind of maybe making a little money on renting the property out, but it's kind of even Stevens. And then we're actually having this amazing kind of slow travel experience, which I'd never kind of done before, which is because travel, especially when you're taking leave, you've got a limited period of time, and I'm going to this country and I want to see as much as possible in that time. And it can be it's amazing, but I don't know how sustainable it is. But kind of living and working in a country, I can work during the week, and then at the weekends go and do day trips and trips out of the weekends and see the kind of country. And then because I'm living here, I'm learning the local language. The organizations I volunteer with, one is like a community engagement health kind of NGO, kind of 3 days a week. And then a couple of days a week is with the Ministry of Tourism. Everybody there is Timorese. They're all local. They don't speak a lot of English, but so it's a real kind of cultural experience, much more than what you might have from visiting a country for a week or two. And so it's actually going to be interesting. During this time, I did a sort of week in Australia and a couple of weeks in Indonesia, and it just felt so superficial. And I know I can't spend like a year living in every country, but it's been a kind of quite an eye-opener in terms of having that travel experience on a sort of completely different level from what I've done before. So that's kind of a reasonably long-winded way to answer your question, but hopefully it covered a bit of ground.
By the way, one other thing, Jonty, don't let me forget this, because you've been around a bit. But at the end of this, I want to hear your 3 lesser-known destinations outside of Timor-Leste that you would recommend people check out.
Thank you for giving me the heads up.
Yeah, you mentioned superficial. Like you had to have those experiences first to even have anything to compare it to. And that's kind of what you wanted to have in that moment. So it's hard to know what you don't know. I don't want to gloss over that, because it's like a complicated thing. Like you could say, okay, especially when we're considering like the impact of travel, right? If we're going to brand it as superficial, you could say, well, don't go anywhere for a week because it's just superficial. But we know that that's not really how travel works either. Can you dig into that a little bit more?
Everybody's got different experiences. Everybody's got different, as I say, some people, people have been driving around the world for the last 38 years. I've got a friend of mine I was at university with, and he basically cycled all the way across Europe and down into Africa, and he ended up in Armenia, and then he's been setting up the Trans-Caucasus Trail. So that's kind of an amazing thing he's doing. So, everybody's got different interests and tastes. I didn't mean to be judgmental about.
Is that Tom from Tom's Bike?
Yeah, Tom, yeah. Have you spoken to him?
We've had Tom on the show.
Oh, awesome. It was weird because we were at university together. We studied like the same stuff. And then I kind of lost contact with him. And then like 5 or 6 years ago, popped up somewhere on Facebook that he had malaria and he was in the Sudan. And I was like, whoa, this guy is that. I'm just in a corporate job and I'm plugging away, and he's got it. Yeah, he's got an interesting life story to tell. So that's kind of cool.
We got to get him back on the show. Tom's a great guy. You could check him out. Yeah, his website's tomsbiketrip, I think, .com. So anyway.
So I'm not being really judgment. I think when I talk about superficial, I'm thinking about my own perspective and experiences, and like for what I would have. I'd spent 5 days my first ever trip overseas. I went to Istanbul for 5 nights, and that was amazing at the time. And then the trouble with the travel bug is, like the more you do it, the harder it is to get that initial kind of thrill. I find, you kind of have to be doing something a bit different, or, otherwise it's another church, it's another mosque, it's another, you start to see the similarities more than the differences sometimes. And so I think this is just another way of, I've been to cold places and hot places, and I've seen waterfalls and mountains and beaches, and you kind of seen quite a lot of variety there. And now I think I'm going, and I've seen kind of varieties of cultures in different parts of the world. I've been to kind of 6 continents, 7. Well, I've been to Antarctica. So yeah, I've been to all 7 continents. And so, I've seen a fair bit, but I think just personally doing this kind of volunteering and spending some time, that kind of slow travel has given me a different kind of perspective. And I think, as I say, it's going to be interesting traveling in the future, having had this experience. I mean, like even in Indonesia, I was there for a couple of weeks. It was kind of interesting to visit. I kind of felt, because in Timor, I'm not fluent by any means, but I have enough local language that I can sort of have conversations with people, and it's a different kind of experience. When I was like in Indonesia, I was like, whoa, I don't know anything. I can't really communicate. And it's, I mean, you get out what you put in, and obviously if you live somewhere for a year, you've put a lot in and you can get a lot out.
Yes, I wasn't picking on you there. I just wanted to hear a bit more about that, because I agree, like every certain types of travel and lengths of trips, I should say, and all of that has its time and place, right? It all feeds into your own personal journey. But I mean, it is of course a fact that the longer you stay in a place, if you're learning the language and you're just going to get more under the skin of what it really is. And I think, more than anything, this podcast is one of the things I want to come out of this with, is just that idea for people. If they haven't slowed down to that point with their travels yet, perhaps this is an opportunity to consider that, is what I'm saying.
And I think with a sense of, because where I probably got stuck with slow travel before was, am I just going to hang out there? Like, what am I going to do? Like,
right. That's a common hang up, right? It's like, yeah. You're used to being on the fly and doing stuff. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Because I'm a very, you might see like I'm doing blogs, and I've written 5 books whilst I'm here, and I've been on doing TikTok, and I like to keep myself busy. And I also like to, I'm learning actually as I get older, that I'm enjoying the kind of creative process of not just being somebody who reads the guidebook. Now I'm like, I've written a guidebook. Like it's from a personal journey perspective, I've enjoyed being able to be a bit more creative and learning new skills in my kind of middle age now, I guess. So like before this year, I'd never used TikTok before. Now I've got like 2 million views. And it's like, it's a new little skill set, and like, making videos and editing them. And it's just kind of good to kind of learn new stuff as you get older. And I think that's where it wasn't the intent with the volunteering. The volunteering intent was around kind of altruistic purpose, but then the sort of side effect of that has been it's been slow travel with a purpose. Like I am living here, I have a kind of effectively job, but because it's volunteering, and it's Timor-Leste, there's quite a lot of flexibility, so I can have a lot of scope for kind of doing what I want to do. So it's kind of the ideal kind of work environment where you have, you've got a pseudo kind of boss, but I'm not like trying to get promoted, or I'm not worrying about my salary or any of those kind of things. I can just focus on having an amazing experience here and contributing as much as I can to Timor-Leste. So I think that's where the volunteering's really come in. There is the real sense of purpose, and there's a structure around life, but you've also got the time and capacity to go and travel. So that's just been like a bit of an eye-opening experience, which I hadn't really considered before.
Yeah. If somebody listening had that same sort of like, what am I going to do if I'm just there? And for a while, like I like the idea of slow travel, but I mean, I think you nailed it with just saying slow travel with a purpose. You find the purpose around that, whether that's, your own self-development in your free time or volunteering or some kind of project that can open things up in a different way for sure. Let's get into some of the things to do in Timor-Leste. I mean, do you think that, not to take this country and compare it to other lesser known or lesser visited destinations, but do you think perhaps that might be like a low hanging fruit in travel to have an authentic travel experience? Like, I feel like there are a lot of these destinations out there that if you're just willing to, I know Timor-Leste is classified by the UN as a least developed country. You could talk about what that means in terms of parameters. If you're able to kind of travel in that way and you don't mind some discomfort and some different parts that come along with that, visiting places like this is a kind of like a low hanging fruit for those authentic experiences.
Yes, but I think there's the theory and there's the reality. So
yeah.
I guess,
all right, give it to us. Give us the reality.
Well, I guess the good news is that if you visit Timor-Leste, so Timor-Leste gets around 25,000 visitors. Tourists a year. It gets maybe 75,000 visitors, but a lot of those are here on business or returning people. So say 25,000 visitors, tourists a year. In comparison, Bali, which is an hour and a half flight away, last year Bali Airport had 23 million tourists.
Oh my gosh! Wow, that's crazy.
25,000, 23 million. It's like similar part of the world, similar climate, similar kind of attractions in some ways. I went to Bali for the first time a couple of weeks ago, and it was really eye-opening to see the contrast, to go from somewhere where most days I will not see another white person. In Timor, they call them Malay. That's basically the Timorese word for foreigner, Malay. And I went to the office today, it's all Timorese. And then I go to the supermarket and it's all Timorese. And then I wander around the streets because I've got this goal before I leave of walking basically every neighborhood in Dili, which is the capital city where I live. So every morning I've got a kind of Google map, I use Strava, and I'm like, well, I haven't walked those streets. And so I'm literally walking like every street in the city, which is another great kind of slow travel.
You're a go-getter, Jonty.
Yeah, I like to keep myself busy, and it's really eye-opening. I mean, I obviously will have seen more of Dili than most Timorese because I'm literally going to every single little neighborhood, up and down random streets, and seeing all these kind of things that they're not like the major. It's not like major sites, but to me, like, it's weird actually seeing like a small shrine on the corner of the street, which has got this interesting mixture in Timor of Catholicism and their kind of traditional practices. That to me is kind of as exciting as going to a kind of UNESCO World Heritage Site. I mean, it's not, it's obviously not the same quality of the actual thing, but it's the experience and the fact that I'm probably like the only Malay who's ever, or very few Malay will have ever seen these things, and it's very much local community, and this is how they worship. That is just very interesting to me. And there's no so the good side is there's no tourists, but the flip side of that is there's almost no tourist infrastructure, and I don't think you really appreciate how good infrastructure is until you go somewhere without infrastructure. So like the internet, like you said, tonight it's been pretty good, but the internet is very slow. It's kind of like 3G. You do everything through your phone. There's no real kind of Wi-Fi. The roading infrastructure, there's the kind of main roads out of the Dili of the main city is doable, and they spent a lot of money on it, but then it soon just reverts to kind of dirt roads. And at the moment we're in the wet season, so the wet season is kind of like December through to kind of May time, and then kind of June to November. November is the dry season. And so in the wet season, actually, like, large parts of the country are actually inaccessible. Like, you could not get to certain parts of the country because the rivers are flooded, there's no bridges. Like, and he said it's a least developed country, so there's about 35 odd least developed countries in the world out of 200 odd countries. So you're thinking you're in the poorest kind of 15% of countries here. in Dili is a bit of a bubble. So Dili is the capital city. Its population is about 300,000 out of about 1.3 million across Timor-Leste. The second biggest city in Timor-Leste, so the capital, 300,000. The second biggest, Balcao, it's about 20,000. Like, it's just a vast kind of and then when you get out of Balcao, you're very much into what they call kind of the districts, and you've got people living in subsistence farming lifestyles. There is things like child malnutrition, stunting, death rates, like diseases. I mean, whilst I've been here, I think as a tourist you'll be fine, but as somebody who lives here, like I've had dengue fever, I've had chikungunya, I've had typhoid, I've had amoeba. Like you learn to appreciate being in a developed world where things work and you don't get sick a lot. That is the kind of flip side of it. So I think, again, it's interesting to say like an authentic experience. I mean, it's authentic. It's easy to equate kind of rough conditions with being authentic, and if it's like back in New Zealand, is it any less authentic being in New Zealand where we can drink the tap water and I have running hot water and reliable electricity? Like, is that as authentic? Because, it's interesting about authenticity and how you see it. But certainly from a Timorese welcome to tourists is, they're very welcoming. And every morning, like the word I hear most from Timorese is Malai, because I will literally walk down the street, and particularly kids, they'll be like, Malai, and you can it's amazing. You walk around the corner and you can see their face of just like almost confusion, and like, why is there a Malai walking through my neighborhood, which like no Malai walk through this neighborhood? And so it's kind of, and then I go bon dia, and they go bon dia, and diakalai, how are you? And where are you going? And itabana there. And you can, those little moments are quite nice. And I guess like when I was in Bali, I felt that if a local approached me, I always got slightly kind of, I tensed up slightly because I'm like, well, they're going to try and get money out of me. They're going to try and sell me a taxi or a massage or some meal or something. There's very much more of a transactional kind of relationship feel in countries with kind of mass tourism, because that's kind of what they're there. Like that's the flip side. You get the mass tourism with all the downside, and the upside is you get some money. That isn't the experience one would have in Timor-Leste.
Authenticity is a loaded word. You're right. I mean, it just depends on what you equate it to. In this case, like you said, is it any less authentic to be, living in New Zealand? And, the whole example you shared, I agree. I mean, that's authentic travel just as much. Yeah. Like you said, if you're equating it to like how much you're going to be bombarded and tried to be sold things as a tourist, some places just come with more of that. Like they see you as a tourist more as perhaps like, what's this guy, like you said, what's this guy doing in our neighborhood? They're just not used to seeing that. That creates different types of interactions, I suppose. It's not that you can't have those interactions in heavily touristed areas. I mean, I've been to heavily touristed areas many times, and I've still been able to like connect with locals and, do all the things you want to do as a traveler. So it's not like that will hold you back. But in this way, like visiting a place like this, like you said, it comes with risks, but it's almost like, I guess the point I was trying to make is you're almost guaranteed to be in those situations, as opposed to like maybe perhaps more having to seek it out.
Correct. And one of the things I love about Timor-Leste it's very safe. It's one of the safest countries in Southeast Asia. And obviously I'm speaking from a perspective of a white male, and I know plenty of women have traveled around Timor-Leste and by themselves, and they've been fine. You obviously take the usual kind of precautions around what you're doing. But I never feel, apart from the dogs, and that's because I've got a phobia of dogs, and there's lots of dogs in Timor-Leste, so that's something I've had to kind of deal with. And they're generally, you can manage, they bark a bit, but you just have to kind of understand the dog mentality of kind of protecting their home and what you're kind of up to. But I walk around, let's say every morning in Dili, I have a camera, like quite a reasonably nice camera hanging around my neck and a new iPhone in my hand, and I feel totally safe. Like I've never had even an inkling of any situation whereby somebody might try and take those off me, or they might kind of ask me some questions about it. They're either ignoring you or they're saying hello, and it's amazing actually. Like, so bon dia, so there's the Tess in the local language has got heavily influenced by Portuguese, because it was a Portuguese colony for about 400 years. And so in the morning you say bon dia, in the afternoon you say boa tarde. So saying that says, if you say it to Timorese or they say it to you, it's kind of instinct. You automatically get a response. But then when I start saying diakalai, which is basically how are you, the look, that smile that appears, because they're suddenly like, oh, he knows slightly more. And then if I use a little bit more local language, they're like, oh, your Teton's really good. And it's just, you can engage and you can have those conversations very kind of easily, I'd say. But say like in heavily touristed places, it's possible. It's just harder.
Sure. Okay. Well, let's talk about some of the things to do. You've got a pretty cool list you sent over of some of the attractions. And I know part of your job is to help promote the tourism there, even with little tourism infrastructure. You're still able to get around and do things like anywhere else. Tell us what we can see if we come, perhaps there's a listener out there that's going to end up in Timor-Leste sending you a note. Hey, I'm here. Show me around.
I hope so.
Where should we start here?
So actually, just for reference, so Timor-Leste is about an hour north of Australia. It's at the end of the archipelago of Indonesian islands. And the last kind of island, and one of the last islands in that kind of chain is the island of Timor. Half of that is West Timor, which is part of Indonesia. And then Timor-Leste, which was known as East Timor before independence, is the kind of the eastern half. So it's from a scale perspective, I think it's about the size of like Connecticut. I'm not very good on my US states, but it's not that big. I think it's like a fifth of the size of Tasmania as a kind of landmass. So it's quite a small place, but it's actually got a huge amount of variety. So it's very mountainous. Like half of the land is at a 40-degree slope or more. It's got amazing mountains up to 3,000 meters in the middle, and then it's an island that's like 9 degrees off the equator. So it's got beaches all around the outside, and so that kind of landscape. So it's got a lot of kind of variety. So I guess the first place I'd start is probably the main thing that Timor-Leste will be known for people visiting, which is the diving and snorkeling. So Timor-Leste sits in what they call the current Coral Triangle, which is this kind of area of the South East Asia where they've got a huge diversity of fish and coral and all sorts of kind of aquatic life. And the waters around Timor are very... So I do a bit of diving, a bit of snorkeling. I wouldn't say like I'm a world expert on diving, but I have spoken to people who are divers and snorkelers who have been to lots of places around the world. And they say the coral in Timor-Leste is as good as anywhere in the world in terms of the how healthy the reefs are. They've done surveys, and I think they've said that the reefs around Atu Island, which is about an hour and a half by ferry from Dili, or like a 15-minute flight, and that's the kind of main epicenter for kind of diving and snorkeling. They say that that is as good as anywhere they've been. And the surveyed, so they've done surveys of fish, and they said the reefs around there are some of the most biodiverse reefs in the world. So they've counted like 400 different species of fish that lives on these reefs. So that is a real kind of draw card for Timor-Leste. But to caveat, like it's amazing, but you're not. You might. I don't think I've seen a stingray, but it's not the sort of place that has the giant manta ray stingray or the big sharks. There's other places that have those kind of large aquatic animals. This is really around the kind of diversity and the smaller stuff, and it's really amazing. And it's so accessible. Like I went snorkeling in Fiji and then diving there, and it was probably 45 minutes to an hour to get out to the good sites. Here, it's like a 5-minute boat trip. Like there's a lot of good snorkel sites. You just walk in off the beach and you go snorkeling. I went snorkeling on Sunday morning in Dili, and there was nobody at the beach, and the coral starts about 5 meters offshore, and it's beautiful. So that's a really amazing thing. I guess something that's interesting for Timor-Leste as well is it's one of the few places in the world, possibly actually probably the only place in the world, that you potentially can swim with blue whales. Now, there are other places you can do like humpback and humpback whales, in particular like Tonga and places like that. And Sri Lanka had a big sort of whale industry. And in Australia, you can do with like whale sharks. But yeah, so every year around kind of November-ish time, late October, November, there's this migration of blue whale. And they basically come through the channel literally past Dili. And so that is a popular draw for people to come and you swim, so you jump in with snorkel gear. I mean, they're migrating, so they're not kind of hanging around. It's not, some of the other areas are kind of more like breeding or feeding areas. Here they get it from A to B, but it's still pretty cool when you've got like a 35-meter long whale swims past you. And that's it's kind of puts things in perspective. I mean, I have a lot of concerns about just swimming with whales in general as an industry, which I won't go too much into, but but it is one of the few places you can do that. So yeah, snorkeling and diving, great thing to do.
Okay. So world-class snorkeling and diving, opportunity to swim with blue whales, and very accessible. Awesome.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's cool. Number 2, hiking. And I've got a slight bias here because I'm a big hiker and I'm really trying to promote Timor-Leste as a hiking destination.
Oh, yeah. We love hiking here. So.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
It's an amazing way, like total slow travel. Like it's a fantastic way to actually see bits of the country that you wouldn't normally see and have interactions and experiences you wouldn't normally have. And Timor-Leste, it's very mountainous. So there's like Mount Ramelau is the highest point in the country. It's about 3,000 meters above sea level. And so it's pretty big. Like it was funny because before I came to Timor-Leste, I did a bit of research. There was nothing online really, which is why I've written guidebooks and made websites and tried to promote the country. But I hadn't really... You have like an image of a small island in Southeast Asia, what it might look like. It doesn't look like the Swiss Alps. But then I'm 3,000 meters up on a mountain and it looks like the Swiss Alps, or it looks like there's always other amazing kind of landscapes. There's natural hot pools, like hot springs that you can kind of go and sit in. There's lots of kind of diversity of vegetation. And then you've got the villages are fascinating to see. So there's always a lot of kind of variety. There is tracks everywhere across the country. Because that's how people get around. So that's kind of the good news. The bad news is there's basically zero signage and no infrastructure. So you kind of have to go with some local guides to kind of be able to get anywhere. And maybe have a bit of, this is not beginner's hiking. I kind of call it frontier kind of hiking because you need to be able to, there's no kind of campsites really. Like I've ended up camping in schoolhouses and in markets and in random places. But the scenery is fantastic. It's kind of a bit surreal. I don't know if you've been or know Wellington in New Zealand, the capital, but that is the Dili is. So I live in Wellington and I'm living in Dili, and Dili is like a tropical version of Wellington. Like it's got beautiful coastline and beaches, but then it's got all these hills that go up behind, and there's amazing hiking up into the hills. So the hiking, I would say is, amazing. And I've never seen any other Malay out there hiking. I've been helping to find new routes. There's a whole spectrum. Like I've written a book about it. Like there's some easy walks around Dili, which are like an hour and a half flat, straightforward. Or you can spend 8 days and you can walk from one side of the country to the other side of the country. So there's a lot of kind of variety on offer. So hiking is a good one.
Okay, great. Yeah. I mean, I'm familiar with Wellington, but I haven't been there yet. I haven't been to New Zealand yet. So it's interesting you made that comparison. Yeah, we should mention Jonty Travels is your blog. I mean, these books you're mentioning and everything, is that through your website that people can find it? Or? Yeah,
so I've been running Jonty Travels, which is a travel blog for the last 10 years. So that's good for the sort of 75 countries I've visited. The key one for Timor-Leste is exploringtimor.com. And if you visit exploringtimor.com, that I've spent quite a lot of time and effort, and it has a lot more information than what we can cover on the blog today. And it goes through the logistics of like how do you get here and visas and accommodation and food. And it talks about all the things you can do. And it talks about all different regions and areas of Timor-Leste. And then off there are links. So I've written there's a guidebook called Exploring Timor-Leste, which is available on Amazon. There's a Exploring Timor-Leste on Foot, which is a hiking guide to Timor-Leste, which is the first one that's been written. And then I've done a couple of photography books as well. And then there's a TikTok channel, which is Exploring Timor-Leste. There's a YouTube channel, Exploring Timor-Leste, and there's an Instagram channel, Exploring Timor-Leste, and they've all got kind of slightly different content. So I've tried to be fairly comprehensive with what there is. So that's, if you're interested in any of this, please check those places out.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. Yeah, that's we'll link up to that in the show notes. That's a nice companion piece to this if you want to get the visuals of what some of the stuff we're talking about.
It's beautiful. Like it's a beautiful. Yeah. It's when I show people photos, they're like, "Wow!" Like they did not expect that from Timor-Leste. They didn't expect the mountains. There's some beautiful coastal scenery. There's just a lot of variety. So, I'll check those out.
Okay. All right. So we got the snorkeling, the diving. We got the hiking. What else you got for us? Number 3.
Number 3 is Timor-Leste has a fascinating history it's quite grim. I have to say, like, there are elements of like Cambodia in terms of under the regime there and some of the things that happened. So Timor-Leste was colonized by the Portuguese. They came here for the sandalwood, which was just really good for general purpose wood and probably with ships as well. They basically chopped down all the trees, so there's no sandalwood left. And it was never really a real priority for the Portuguese. It was always one of the kind of forgotten colonies. That's the reason why it's slightly different history. So you had the Dutch and the Portuguese fighting in this kind of part of the world, and obviously the Dutch part became Indonesia, and then the Portuguese part is Timor-Leste. So then the Japanese invaded during World War II. They didn't treat the locals very well, as they did elsewhere in Asia. And then the Portuguese kind of came back after Second World War. There was the revolution in Portugal in 1975, and the Timorese were like, fantastic, after 400 years of colonization, we now get to have our own country. They had their own country for approximately 10 days, and then the Indonesian army invaded. And it was a pretty brutal invasion, and it was a very brutal occupation. So they were in Timor-Leste from 1975 to 1999. Estimates vary, but like even the most conservative estimates were that hundreds of thousands of Timorese died. Some of them were that you can visit in Dili, the prisons that they kind of put 20, 30 people into a dark, small room and just fed them once a day. There was also kind of executions going on, and then there was kind of large scale starvation of the local population as well. So it's a very grim history that isn't particularly well known, but the Indonesian occupation was, very brutal. 1999, they had a referendum, and that the Timorese kind of voted for independence. The Indonesian president at the time wouldn't allow UN peacekeepers to go into the country, and then the Indonesians on their way out and the Indonesian-backed militia basically adopted a scorched earth policy. So between 80 and 90% of all the buildings in the country were destroyed. The electricity grid was destroyed. Like everything was destroyed. So I talk about the infrastructure in Timor-Leste not being very good. That's because they had 3 years of kind of UN kind of, finally the peacekeepers came in and there was an element of kind of things came a bit more under control. It became a country and joined the kind of UN in 2002. So Timor-Leste.
So what do you mean that the infrastructure, they sabotaged the infrastructure?
Yeah. When they left, they were like, well, if we can't have Timor-Leste, we're just going to destroy everything. And there was massacres, like there was in Likisar, and there was a whole bunch of people, they basically shot them or burnt them in a church. And there was some really horrific stuff that happened in the late 90s. So, yeah, really quite great. And in Dili in particular, there's the National Resistance Museum, which tells the kind of history very well of kind of Timor-Leste. There's the Shager exhibition, which Shager was an old prison, which the Indonesians used for kind of torturing people. So that's interesting place to visit. And there's the Santa Cruz Cemetery, and that's what really got the world's attention. Was in the early 90s. There was an independence kind of campaigner. He was killed by Indonesian troops. They had a funeral for him. On the march from the church to the cemetery, Indonesian troops fired upon the crowd and killed hundreds of people. Luckily, there was a British journalist, Max Stahl, who videoed the massacre, and then he hid the videotape in the graveyard, like he buried it underneath the grave, and he went back at night, like 3 days later, and recovered it and then sent it to the world's media. And that really got kind of the attention of the UN and other places around what was actually happening in Timor-Leste, because it's quite kind of undercover. So it's kind of a forgotten bit of history in Southeast Asia, which is very grim, but it's fascinating. And so that's kind of, I wouldn't say it's like a tourist attraction, but but there is that kind of dark tourism kind of element to that, and it is just an interesting aspect to learn.
It's important, I think, to dive into that history and to understand. I mean, all of that is woven into the fabric of the culture there. I mean, it has to be. These people, family members, live through this. This isn't like that. Even some of the stuff isn't even that long ago that you're referring to. So it's like, you can't just parse that out as, oh, it's just a thing that's happened and now it's over. It's like, I do think that it's important to dive in to those types of historical facts when you visit a place, to just at least try to yeah, you get a bit of an understanding of what people have been through, what they may have been through, where they're coming from. Yeah, I mean, history's obviously it's important to not forget. I mean, it's so crazy when you think about, there's events like this that it's just like I've never heard of any of this. Hundreds of thousands of people dying, never even heard of it.
Yeah, gives some perspective on things. I guess also because it is so recent, when I go walking around and I see, like an elderly person in Timor, I'm like, they've lived through some really rough times. Like seriously, like just, it's a bit like, I guess, our grandparents and maybe World War II or some of those kind of events, but especially from most kind of developed worlds, those days are quite far in the past, whereas here it is recent. And you go to places and there's still like a whole bunch of buildings that are just kind of abandoned or destroyed or it's quite in your face still potentially if you're kind of looking for it. And it's an interesting kind of segue into my kind of fourth thing to look at, which is so one of the kind of unintended consequences of the Indonesian occupation was that Timor-Leste is the second most Catholic country in the world. Can you guess the most Catholic?
The Vatican?
The Vatican. The Vatican is the only country more Catholic than Timor-Leste. So Timor-Leste is somewhere like 97, 98% Catholic. Like it's like record-breaking kind of levels of Catholicism. And obviously like the Vatican's quite a small place, whereas Timor-Leste is like 1.3 million people. And it's funny because the Portuguese were in Timor-Leste for like 400 years, and obviously Catholic country, and they built churches and they missionaries. And I think they only got to maybe 50, 60% of the population as Catholic. But when the Indonesians came in, they basically said, like, you have to be one of 5 religions. Like, you have to be Jewish. Well, there's no kind of Jews in Timor. So you have to be Hindu, where there's no history of Hinduism here. You've got that in Bali. You have to be Muslim. And given that the occupiers' religion was predominantly Muslim, Timorese are like, well, we're not going to become Muslim. So they basically will end up becoming Catholic. And it's like an interesting parallel with, say, like Poland during communism, where the Catholic Church in Poland was one of the only kind of institutions that wasn't kind of corrupted or controlled by the communists or the Soviet Union. So in Timor-Leste, the church was seen as a state institution, a bit separate from the government, and so there was a lot of faith and trust in the church. So very Catholic country, and so you'll just see there are a lot of churches, if you like, but they're not like there's a cathedral in Dili, and there's some larger kind of churches around, but there's nothing that's kind of there's no St. Peter's, there's no St. Paul's, there's no kind of amazing architecture themselves. But what I love is, especially if you get outside of Dili into some of the districts, you just see the local church, and you go on Sunday morning and the church is full and it's overflowing. Like, it's a really serious thing here, and everybody goes to mass, and there's different kind of religious events that happen throughout the year. And there's actually an interesting link into hiking. So the highest peak, Mount Ramelau, and the second highest peak, Mount Matabien, they're also pilgrimage sites. So Mount Ramelau gets, I think, 25,000 people summit Mount Ramelau every year. Probably about 2% of those are actual tourists, and 98% of those are Timorese who are going on pilgrimage, particularly during there's like sort of 2 events, I think March and November each year, relating to the Virgin Mary. And there's a statue of the Virgin Mary on top of one, there's a statue of Jesus on top of the other. And so that is a real kind of, as I say, authentic kind of cultural experience to see. And then also Catholicism, they still incorporated some of their traditional, which goes to my kind of 5th item, which is their traditional culture. So you have traditional Timorese culture, you have what's called an umalulik, and every person can really trace their family back to their umalulik. And it's generally it can be thatched, it can be modern now with like a corrugated roof. It has every single district has a sort of slightly different design of them, and a lot of the activities around it relate to things like the harvest. So obviously for thousands of years, the harvest, and lots of cultures, the harvest is really important. And so when they have like the first harvest of the year, there's a whole bunch of ceremonies that relate to it in the Umalulik. And so it's interesting to see that culture. And the kind of traditional Ulamalulek is a kind of thatched kind of building, potentially on stilts. And so they're quite kind of photogenic, but it's interesting how they've combined elements of the Umalulik, which includes like a totem pole with 3 branches, and they've taken that and they've incorporated it into Catholicism with and so churches will have these traditional Timorese things in it. So that's kind of an interesting kind of combo to see.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Umalulik. I'm a visual thinker, and anybody else listening, so they can get it's UMA and then LULIK. Yeah, I'm looking at one on your website. You have an Umalulik hike. Yeah, it looks like a giant thatched umbrella, basically, that people consider, but like a building. Yeah,
I've seen quite a lot of them now, but it's interesting how they do vary in design quite a lot. I got a great photo somewhere, I think near Alaga in Bacau, where there's 5 Umalulik next to each other, and like one is like a traditional thatch, and then there's one which is like a bit more modern, and then the other one left's like a brand new one. And it's one of these things a bit like in like Japan. The temples in Japan have been there for hundreds of years, but every 20 years they rebuild them. And the same with the Ulalulik. It looks old, but actually, like particularly the thatching, you've got to rethatch it. So they're kind of they just keep renovating the same kind of structure.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So it's like you said it's like a sacred house. That's cool.
Yeah.
Okay. We have 3 more on this list, I think.
Yeah, I'll go a bit quicker. So relating to the Portuguese piece, so the Portuguese say we're here for kind of 400, 450 years. So there is a reasonable amount of Portuguese colonial architecture and heritage. So that's kind of interesting to see, particularly in Balcao, the second biggest city. There is quite a few kind of colonial buildings. And so if you're interested in that kind of architecture, that's quite cool to ski. There are also quite a few kind of ruins. So if you're into that kind of atmospheric kind of, actually, large part, it's a bit of a funny analogy, but large parts of Timor-Leste remind me of when I visited Chernobyl in Ukraine. Because there you kind of go.
That's a comparison I didn't expect.
It's probably the first person about the comparison. But so you go to the obviously there's a whole history about the Chernobyl power station, the meltdown, but actually what people often take away and what they photograph are things like the fairground with the Ferris wheel that's like abandoned, and there's the stadium that's all just kind of turning back into kind of forest, and that's the thing actually that I was a bit surprised, or like I thought Chernobyl was about the power station. It's actually about the town of Chernobyl, and you go into the apartment buildings and they're all kind of falling apart because nobody's kind of lived there for 30 years with no maintenance. Like there's large parts of Timor-Leste like that. So if you like a sort of photographically decaying building with grass and things growing out of it, then that is available. I guess a bit like Angkor Wat in Cambodia. Yeah, people don't want to see the nicely rebuilt temple. They want the one with all the trees growing out of it, and you can see that kind of passage of time. So, and then number 7 around Balabo. So Balabo is a small town in kind of the western part of Timor-Leste. It kind of not shot to fame, but it's best known for the Balabo Five. So these were 5 Australian-based journalists, although they were a mixture of Brits, Kiwis, and Australians, and they were there to report on the Indonesian invasion. And it's all were journalists, and then the Indonesian army went in and murdered them basically, and then they covered it all up. And so that obviously created a bit of an international incident with the Australian government, and so there's a bit of history around that. And there's also some museums and some interesting things in Balabo, and there's a very good hotel there. Generally, outside of Dili, there's not that many places to stay, but Balabo's got one of the better kind of places. And then the last one on my item is just around coffee. So, coffee. So, as I say, so this is not like depressing or there's no massacres involved, but it's interesting. So, Timor-Leste is, and there's random things you learn from living in a place. The World Bank have said that Timor-Leste is the most oil and gas dependent economy in the world, like more than Qatar, more than any of the Middle Eastern countries. Something like 90% of all the revenue, basically the entire Timorese government is paid for by the revenue from oil and gas in primarily the sort of the Timor Gap. So this is the kind of the sea between Timor-Leste and Australia. And there's some very interesting, the Australian government has behaved very badly. Like basically they bugged the Timorese government to get an advantage in negotiations about, like, it's just, if you look into it, it's quite shocking, with one of the richest countries in the world basically screwing over one of the poorest countries in the world for their resources. I'll let you Google that, but yeah, certainly there's an interesting history there. But so it's very oil and gas dependent, but you don't see any sign of that. It's all kind of offshore. There's nothing to see. But the second, third, and fourth biggest items in the economy, or kind of income, is remittances from Timorese overseas. So there's a lot go to Australia to kind of pick fruit and vegetables every year. Amazingly, tourism is one of the biggest export industries in Timor-Leste. Even though there's no tourists, it's still like one of the biggest industries. It's that kind of, the economy is that kind of skewed to oil and gas. And then the third one is coffee. And so coffee is actually a kind of a growth opportunity for Timor. Everything is organic. And if you go to somewhere like Amira or Nara, which are the big kind of coffee growing areas, you just see fields of coffee everywhere. And if you go at the right time of the year, you've got the white flowers, we've got the beans growing. So, and actually Starbucks. So Starbucks is like, most of the coffee in Timor-Leste is bought by Starbucks, and they have it's one of those kind of specialty kind of blends that they kind of promote. So it's a kind of success story for Timor. It's a question of how much more can they kind of scale that up, because at the moment it's quite kind of inefficient. It's literally just, I've planted some coffee trees and we're going to pick this harvest every year, and there's a bit of processing, but it's quite a kind of immature industry. But certainly if you're into coffee, you can see the whole process from kind of from the plant through to the cup of coffee, and there's a few kind of different tours and things you can do.
Wow. Okay. Plenty to do and see. And I mean, I guess just give us the vibe of the local people.
Very friendly, very welcoming, limited English, particularly if you get outside of Dili. Portuguese is actually, so they've got two official languages, Portuguese and Teton, which is the local language. Actually, Portuguese isn't as widely spoken as, Portuguese visitors come here and expect to be able to speak Portuguese with everybody, and they can't. But so language can be a bit of a challenge, but generally very welcoming, very friendly, very kind of family orientated, and obviously the Catholic Church is a major part of their society. Very tolerant around things like the traffic in Dili. Like outside Dili, there's no traffic. There's not a lot of vehicles, but in Dili, the traffic is Southeast Asian, lots of motorbikes, cars weaving around. I mean, I ride a motorbike. It's both exhilarating and terrifying. Every time I go out, I'm like, I love this, and then I get home and I'm like, I'm so glad I'm still alive. Like it's a real.
That sounds like the motorbike experience in a nutshell. Unless you're experienced and you ride motorcycles, I've felt very much the same way before.
So it's really, but they're very. I've never seen any road rage. Like even though they use the horn a bit, but there's actually like they use the horn with purpose, which is about telling you that they're behind you or whatever's going on. But I've never seen any kind of road rage or anything happening. And there's so many. I'm sure there are road rules, but there's quite a lot of just like random junctions with there's no roundabout, there's no lights. You just somehow it kind of works. And so they're just quite kind of tolerant around that kind of experience. And I think from a religious perspective, even though they're 98% Catholic, there is a quite a large mosque in Timor, and bizarrely, some of the Muslim religious holidays are national holidays in Timor-Leste, despite the fact the Muslim population is like 0.3% of the population. There's probably more Muslims in New Zealand. We don't get Eid as a national holiday in New Zealand, whereas in Timor-Leste they have that as a public holiday. And there's a Hindu temple which was built. It was built by the Indonesians for their soldiers. A lot of the soldiers who involved in the occupation came from Bali, so they built a Hindu temple in Dili so that the soldiers could worship and pray in the temple. And the Timorese government is spending money rebuilding the temple. And they've got they've consolidated them down to two major cemeteries now for the Indonesian soldiers who died in Timor-Leste. Timor-Leste is paying money to maintain these cemeteries. Like there's a level of, forgiveness or tolerance, and the current president Ramses Horta, who was involved a lot throughout the kind of independence process and post-independence. People ask him, like, surely you hate the Indonesians? Like the history of the Indonesian occupation is terrible. you must hate them. And he's like, no, I don't. Like it's very, they've accepted it, and actually they have to, because Indonesians like their neighbors. It's a much bigger economy. And so there's been quite a lot of interesting articles actually talking about Gaza and the situation in the Middle East and Timor-Leste. And there's a whole bunch of things that are completely different. But there are some things in common in terms of this kind of seemingly intractable conflict, resulting in a lot of death and destruction, misery. And somehow out of it, like Timor-Leste was a success story. Like it became an independent country. They've got now good relationships with their neighbors, with Indonesia, and they've kind of moved on. And so it's a kind of a rare like story of kind of hope. I mean, there's a lot of country and there's a lot of specific stuff, but there's some thoughts out of that in terms of themes of what you can do in kind of, I mean, it's a post-conflict country, but actually, if you look at it's interesting. If you Google Timor-Leste, a lot of the advisories that come up from the US State Department or the New Zealand MFAT are like, Timor's all dangerous, and it's really not. Like maybe 15, 20 years ago, it was a bit dodgy, but now it's very, very safe. As with most parts of the world, road accidents are probably the most likely thing that's going to happen. Like, or you might catch a mosquito-based disease, but you're highly unlikely to get mugged or any like violent anything happening to you. So, that's a kind of reputational thing that Timor. If people have heard of Timor-Leste, they associate it potentially with those conflicts from 20 years ago, and it's a different kind of country now.
How has it been for you to get TikTok, quote unquote, famous in Timor-Leste? Because I know you got you're doing these TikToks like you mentioned earlier, and what I read on the website is that you're getting recognized in public a lot because people there are following you.
Yeah, in the supermarket So I'm world famous in Timor-Leste, which is kind of good because when I leave Timor-Leste, nobody will know me unless I run into maybe some Timorese overseas. But it's interesting experience. When you've got just random strangers come up to you. I was going for a hike at the weekend, and I was leading a group of people, and one of the cars got stuck in the mud because it's the wet season, and some Timorese jumped out the bush with some rope, and they pulled the car out of the mud. And then this guy was also driving through, and he got out the car, and then he's like, "Are you that like exploring Timor guy?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Oh, this guy's amazing, and you should see his videos." And I'm like, "This is quite surreal." And it's interesting what is popular. So the most popular videos I have are a mixture of like, I've got a video about Maliana, which is one of the biggest cities, and I've got some ones about some of the accommodation you could stay at. And then the videos I do on the waste management systems and the stormwater systems in Timor-Leste, they're like guaranteed. I'm like, if I do a video about like bins and rubbish collection in Timor, I'm going to get like 10,000 views. Like it's almost kind of guaranteed. So it's kind of an interesting, because I'm trying to show on the TikTok and other things, and hopefully on this podcast, I love Timor-Leste. It's a fantastic country, but like every country's got issues, and the ones in Timor are quite obvious when you just see the piles of rubbish up there, or you see all the stuff in the gutters. And so I'm just kind of trying to give people the full kind of perspective, really.
Are any plans to stay?
Thought about it quite a lot. It's a real roller coaster. And I think that's one of the things to take away from the kind of volunteering and living somewhere is that, and particularly I think in a least developed country, is that the highs are so high. They're just like, I've had some amazing experiences and things that you like some of the hikes are done and just like amazing experiences. And I've had some real lows, and they can be in the same day. They could be within like an hour of each other. So it's very much a roller coaster, and that is exhausting. Actually, it is amazing, but it is quite a tiring kind of experience. And it's almost like the quantity. I'm not sure my brain can cope with more experiences. It's a bit like when you go if you do like a full-time trip for 3 or 4 months, like you come out of that and you're just very tired because you've done a lot of things and your brain's trying to process it all. So we did think a lot about staying longer in Timor, but I kind of feel like I have been to pretty much everywhere in the country and done quite a lot. So it's
fair enough.
We did consider it. But.
Before I let you go, we mentioned we're going to get your 3 lesser visited or maybe perhaps less touristed destination recommendations from places you've been.
Yeah.
Can you share?
Yeah, certainly. Well, I would say Iran, but you can't really visit Iran at the moment. That's the challenge. But Iran is one of my favorite countries to go to. Up there with Timorese. some of the most hospitable people you ever meet, amazing sights and scenery, just amazing country, but you can't visit it really at the moment. So we'll take that off the list. As I mentioned earlier, Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a fascinating country. You've got a huge, and again, like there was conflict there, but now it's stable and you can visit. There's very few tourists. I remember going to one of the major tourist sites, and I said, well, how many people visit here? And they're like, oh, it's really busy. Like in peak season, we get like 200 people a day. And you're like, well, that's not a lot, So, and you visit, like, if you go to something like Lalibela, which has got the famous kind of churches that have literally been carved out of the rock down into the rock. And then there's, again, kind of religion, the kind of church history, but a lot of interesting stuff there. Addis Ababa is a kind of interesting city. Again, a very interesting kind of history. It was the only African country not to be colonized, apart from the Italians for a few years around kind of World War II. And there's really good hiking, and there's amazing kind of scenery and mountains and things. So Ethiopia, I would highly recommend. Somewhere that's a bit closer to home for some listeners is Moldova. So Moldova is the least visited country in Europe. Although probably Belarus now might be because of some of the restrictions with the Ukraine situation. And also obviously Ukraine's probably not got many tourists at the moment. Ukraine is amazing as well, by the way. But Moldova was just, it was again, it didn't have like the amazing UNESCO World Heritage sites, but it had a lot of kind of interesting places to see and visit, and very few other tourists there. Really good wine if you're into wine, and just very kind of walkable cities, and again, kind of an interesting history around the during the Soviet Union era, and then also kind of even now the latest elections. There's been lots of Russian interference and this kind of stuff going on. So Moldova, I would put up there. And then one of my favorite countries as well is Pakistan. Now, it's not as much of a hidden gem as it was when I probably went maybe 5 or 6 years ago. But Pakistan is an amazing country. Obviously, I particularly went up into the north. So if you're into kind of mountain scenery, and then go to Pakistan and you go north up into kind of the Hindu Kush, and you're up to the border with Afghanistan, and there's like you've got K2, you've got some very big mountains, and you've got some amazing views of them. There's some really good kind of road trips, basically, where you kind of go and see some beautiful scenery. The food's pretty good in Pakistan. People are very friendly. Again, it's very safe. Nothing's really going to happen to you. And it's quite different. If you go to southern Pakistan, then that's a bit more kind of like India in terms of like heat, humidity, and number of people. But if you start going north up into the mountains, it's a bit more kind of sparse. And so, Pakistan, I really enjoyed.
Nice. Thanks for that. Anything else you want to leave us with before we part ways?
Papua New Guinea is also very under-touristed, but actually, having been there a couple of times, the tourist infrastructure in Papua New Guinea is definitely better than the tourist infrastructure in Timor-Leste. But Papua New Guinea is a fantastic, fascinating place. But there's safety issues there, like Port Moresby. It's a different level. So actually, it's been quite. It's put things in perspective that how safe Timor is compared to how unsafe Papua New Guinea can be. But there are some amazing experiences to have there. So,
how did you end up in New Zealand?
I was on a project with work, and when I worked for Deloitte in the UK, and they needed like 15 procurement people tomorrow in New Zealand, and they didn't have enough in New Zealand, so they kind of imported some over from the UK, and I was on the project there for 2 months. And then at the end of that, actually the partner of the local firm kind of jokingly said, so you're going to stay in New Zealand? And I said, well, can I? And then they said, well, yeah, we can do like a secondment or transfer. And so I just kind of transferred over with Deloitte. And then I lived in Auckland for 10 years and loved it. And then I moved down to Wellington, the capital, 4 years ago. And particularly the hiking in Wellington there's a lot better and a lot more hiking in Wellington than there is in Auckland. But New Zealand is home, and it's a beautiful country. It's been interesting to see the impact of tourism there, just even like in the kind of 15 odd years that I've been there. The growth of tourism, and then the backlash against tourists. And so it's interesting to see that kind of stuff firsthand. and even just my experiences. Like I remember I've done, so they have these things called the Great Walks. There's 9 Great Walks, or 10 now, sorry, 10 Great Walks, New Zealand. And every year they get harder to book. So things like the Milford Track and the Route Burn, like the Milford now sells out in like 20 minutes. They sell out the entire season's worth of hut tickets. Like it was when I did it in 10 years ago. It would have taken 2 or 3 weeks to sell out, and it was like, oh my god, the Milford Track. If you don't book in this month, you're not going to go. And now it's like, if you don't book within this 15-20 minute slot, you're not going to go. So it's interesting to see that kind of firsthand and what the impact has been.
You on this Exploring Timor website you mentioned, which we're going to link to. At the bottom, it says, it's not an official website, because you're saying you're distinguishing that from like a government website. It's your website.
Which I am actually working on the government website, but because it's my own, I can be a bit more, I can show the good and the bad rather than just having to do my branding. Yeah. Sure.
But at the bottom, it says it's been created by a New Zealander living in Dili, Timor-Leste. I'm wondering, do you just identify now as a New Zealander more than somebody who's British, where you grew up?
Yes, I'm definitely a Kiwi. I upset a Palmer Brit the other day because I said, I was having to introduce myself, and I said, I'm from New Zealand. And she was like, no, you're not, you're from the UK. And I was like, okay, yeah. But she said, you can call yourself a New Zealander, but you can't say that you're from New Zealand. So I think that's a interesting distinction, which I'd probably agree with, is because particularly New Zealand is a very, the population is 5 million, and a quarter of the population are immigrants. So New Zealand is a very accepting country for, we've had mayors of Wellington who basically have kind of been British or kind of have a British accent. There's parliamentarians from all around the world. We had an MP who was asylum seeker from Iran. And so it doesn't feel out of place. And actually, when I'm in New Zealand, I'm kind of accent deaf. Like, I just do not hear that person is from, unless they've got really strong, to differentiate between the British and New Zealand accent. It is a different accent, but there's such a variety of accents being used. And there's so many prominent New Zealanders who, they weren't born in New Zealand. It feels quite legitimate, I think, to call myself a New Zealander. Okay.
But do you miss anything about the UK?
My family. And that's about it, if I'm honest. Like, I go back and it's... and again, you can never go back, because the Britain that I left in 2010 is not the Britain now. And when I go to London, like, London's changed, like, things change. You haven't got a time machine, you can't go back. And cultures progress, and it's quite hard. And I think the thing what I found was when I went... I think I'd been in New Zealand for a couple of years, and then I went back to the UK to see family, and I was homesick for New Zealand. And so that was my kind of emotive feeling. And if I think about like the landscape and the nature, I feel more drawn to the bush and the mountains in New Zealand than the rolling fields in the UK. So it is a debate I have with my family, but and I love seeing the family, and I love, I like visiting them, but the UK's, I'm not. Yeah, New Zealand is where the heart is at.
Right on, man. Well, good luck with the rest of your time there. Thanks for coming on to share your love and the highs and lows of Timor-Leste and some of the things to see. And this is you doing your job, right? Part of your volunteer gig is to help promote tourism. So I was excited to have you on to just, clearly you've spent obviously just a lot of physical time on the ground, but also you've seen a lot. You've taken a lot of time to think through the experience there. And thanks for coming on and sharing it and giving people a sense of what it might be like to come travel there, what they might be able to see. And we love covering some of the lesser known destinations here. So appreciate your time today.
I appreciate it. Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
You have it. Thank you to Jonty Crane for stopping by the show. Of course, we'll link up to all of the resources mentioned and that main website, exploringtimor.com. Are you booking a trip? Maybe not. Yeah, I just find that exploring these destinations through this format, it kind of opens up my other travels as well. Like, even if I'm not booking a flight today to Timor-Leste, it's on my radar now. Perhaps I might one day. And this particular conversation just got me thinking about those lesser known destinations and some of the different types of experiences that you might have on the ground as a traveler that can come with that. So I don't know where this one landed for you. Hopefully you enjoyed it. And if you do want more destination goodies and other travel-related resources, helpful links, and things like that, you can sign up for our newsletter over at zerototravel.com/newsletter. Of course, be sure to stay in touch here on the pod as well. Now, I did ask AI to give me a fun fact related to this episode. Here's what it spit out. I thought this was pretty cool. So we talked about the blue whales. It said the Timor Sea between Timor-Leste and Australia contains some of the deepest whale migration routes in the world. Blue whales, the largest animals ever to exist on Earth, use these waters as a highway between feeding grounds in Antarctica and breeding areas in the tropics. What makes this even more amazing is that these whales can dive up to 500 meters deep and hold their breath for up to 20 minutes. So when travelers get the chance to swim with them near Timor-Leste, they're witnessing one of the planet's most epic annual migrations happening right at the surface level. End quote. So that, again, is from AI. You know, as I was reading it, I was thinking, are blue whales the largest known animal to have ever existed on Earth? And apparently the answer is yes. Far bigger than even any dinosaur, which was kind of shocking to me. So anyway, there's a fun fact. I'm going to leave you with a quote as well. This one I thought was related to the content you heard today. Classic from Robert Frost, who said, 2 roads diverged in the wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. Peace and love to you and yours. Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by zerototravel.com. Ideas and advice to make your travel dreams a reality.